What if all women died, leaving only men, the last generation? Chapter 1. The Cataclysm. The asteroid came without warning on a Tuesday morning in March. Dr. Brian Smith was reviewing genetic sequencing data in his laboratory at the Centers for Disease Control when the first reports began flooding in. A massive impact in the Pacific Ocean had sent shockwaves around the globe, but it was the dust cloud that followed that changed everything. Within hours, the sky had turned an ominous shade of amber. The particles weren't just rock and ice, they carried something else. Something that had been dormant in the void for millions of years, waiting for its moment to reshape a world. Sarah, his wife, called him from the hospital where she worked as a pediatric nurse. "Brian, we're seeing strange cases. Respiratory distress, fever, but only in..." The line went dead. He tried calling back, but the networks were overloaded. By the third day, the pattern became undeniable. Every woman and girl on Earth was dying. It started with flu-like symptoms, fever, cough, fatigue. But within 48 hours, their immune systems would collapse entirely. Organs would shut down one by one as the pathogen, whatever it was, systematically destroyed every sex chromosome carrier it encountered. The hospitals filled with the dying, then emptied as there was no one left to save. Brian worked around the clock with his remaining team, all men now, trying to understand what they were facing. The pathogen was unlike anything in the literature. It seemed to target specific genetic markers found only in those with two X chromosomes. Men with XY chromosome pairs showed a 90% resistance, developing immunity after a brief illness. But for women, there was no recovery. The mortality rate was absolute, 100%. Sarah died on the 5th day, holding Brian's hand as her organs failed one by one. Their 8-year-old daughter Emma had already been gone for 2 days. In less than a week, Brian had lost everything that mattered to him, and so had every other surviving man on Earth. The world's population had been cut in half. Governments collapsed as female leaders, soldiers, and civil servants died en masse. Supply chains broke down when half the workforce disappeared overnight. Communication networks failed as female engineers and technicians succumbed to the plague. But the dying was only the beginning. Chapter 2. The War of Desperation. In the chaos that followed, blame became a weapon. Russia accused the United States of developing a biological weapon that had gone wrong. China pointed fingers at European space agencies, claiming they had contaminated the asteroid during secret missions. The truth that this was a cosmic accident beyond any human design seemed too random, too cruel for leaders desperate to find someone to fight. General Marcus Harrison of the U.S. Armed Forces, now operating from a bunker in Colorado, issued an ultimatum to the remaining Chinese military: surrender their genetic research facilities or face nuclear consequences. The Chinese, led by Admiral Li Wei, responded with similar threats. Across the globe, the remnants of military forces mobilized for what might be humanity's final war. Brian's research facility in Atlanta had become a fortress. Armed guards, all survivors of the plague, protected the laboratories where a skeleton crew of male scientists worked frantically to understand the pathogen. They had isolated the organism, a crystalline entity that seemed almost artificial in its precision. It was as if something had designed the perfect weapon to eliminate a part of humanity. The first major battle erupted over control of the European Center for Disease Prevention in Stockholm. Russian forces clashed with NATO remnants in the streets of the Swedish capital, fighting for access to genetic databases and research materials. The facility was destroyed in the crossfire, along with decades of crucial research. Similar conflicts raged across the globe. The Pasteur Institute in Paris was bombed by extremist groups who believed the plague was divine judgment. The CDC campus in Beijing was seized by warlords who demanded tribute from neighboring settlements. Brian watched in horror as humanity's last hope for understanding the pathogen was systematically destroyed by fear and rage. The breaking point came during the Battle of Geneva. Swiss, French, and German forces had united to protect the World Health Organization headquarters when American bombers arrived to prevent the data from falling into enemy hands. As the first missiles struck the building, Dr. Peter Rodriguez, the WHO's last surviving senior scientist, broadcast a final message to the world. We are committing suicide while already dying. If we continue this madness, there will be no one left to mourn us. The message reached General Harrison in his bunker, Admiral Lee in his submarine command center, and the dozen other military leaders who still controlled nuclear weapons. For the first time since the plague began, they paused to consider what they were fighting for in a world where victory meant ruling over an extinction. Dr. James Crawford, a former colleague of Brian's who had survived at the Moscow Institute of Genetics, managed to establish contact between the remaining research facilities. His message was simple. We have maybe 10 years of stored genetic material. After that, our species ends. We can fight over the corpse of civilization, or we can try to save what's left of humanity. The ceasefire began with a single gesture. General Harrison ordered his forces to stand down and sent a message to all remaining military leaders. Dr. Crawford is right. We're fighting over a graveyard. If we want our species to survive, we need to work together. Chapter 3. The Fragile Alliance. The Global Survival Alliance was born in a converted airplane hangar in Switzerland, one of the few facilities large enough to accommodate representatives from every surviving nation. The meeting was unlike any diplomatic gathering in human history. Every delegate was male. Every discussion was shadowed by the ghosts of the women they had lost. Brian represented the scientific community alongside 50 other researchers from around the world. They faced military commanders who had spent months preparing for war, religious leaders grappling with the theological implications of the plague, and civil administrators trying to maintain order in societies that had lost half their members overnight. The negotiations were brutal. Resources were scarce. Trust was non-existent. And every decision carried the weight of species survival. General Harrison clashed repeatedly with Admiral Lee over territorial divisions. African warlords demanded guarantees of autonomy in exchange for protecting research facilities. European leaders insisted on maintaining cultural preservation programs even as cities crumbled around them. But slowly, agreements emerged. The Scientific Preservation Protocol established protected zones around research facilities, placing them under international protection. The Peace Enforcement Corps was created from volunteers drawn from every surviving military, tasked with maintaining order without the devastating wars that had nearly destroyed their remaining resources. Dr. Marcus Webb, formerly of Oxford University, was elected as the Alliance's first scientific director. His mandate was clear: find a way to ensure human survival, regardless of the cost. Brian was appointed as head of genetic research, a position that made him one of the most important people on Earth. The work began immediately. Brian's team, now expanded with scientists from 30 countries, focused on understanding the pathogen's mechanism. They had confirmed it was extraterrestrial in origin, but its precision suggested something more than random evolution. The organism seemed designed to target mammalian females specifically, as if crafted by an intelligence that understood genetic vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, the Alliance worked to maintain civilization. Food production had to be restructured as agricultural communities lost their female workers. Educational systems were redesigned to function with all male teaching staff. Social services were reimagined to address the unique psychological trauma of a world without mothers, daughters, or wives. But the fragile peace was constantly tested. Radical survivalist groups rejected the Alliance's authority, believing that humanity's future lay in smaller, stronger communities that could defend themselves against any threat. The purist movement gained followers among those who saw the plague as evidence that genetic manipulation was forbidden by nature itself. Violence erupted regularly. A settlement in Montana was massacred by raiders who believed its residents were hoarding medical supplies. Religious extremists in the Middle East declared that any attempt to recreate women through science was blasphemy, worthy of death. Underground networks smuggled pre-plague genetic material, selling it to the highest bidder regardless of the alliance's distribution protocols. Bryan's own facility came under attack 3 times in the first year. The Peace Enforcement Corps established a permanent garrison around the Atlanta complex, but the threats continued. Death threats arrived daily from groups who saw his research as either humanity's salvation or its final damnation. Despite the challenges, progress was being made. The Alliance had established farming cooperatives that were beginning to stabilize food production. Educational programs were training a new generation of teachers, doctors, and engineers from the surviving population. Most importantly, the research was advancing. Bryan's team had successfully mapped the pathogen's complete genetic structure and begun developing countermeasures. They had also made breakthrough discoveries in artificial reproductive technology, combining pre-plague research with desperate innovation. The biomechanical wombs were crude prototypes, but they worked. The first successful gestation of a mouse embryo in an artificial environment had occurred 14 months after the plague. The mouse was born healthy and showed complete resistance to the pathogen when exposed to controlled doses. It was a female mouse, the first healthy female mammal born on Earth since the plague began. Chapter 4. The Promise of Tomorrow. 3 years after the plague, Bryan stood in Laboratory 7, watching the most important experiment in human history. Inside a cylindrical chamber filled with synthetic amniotic fluid, a human embryo was developing normally at 18 weeks gestation. The readouts showed all systems functioning properly, but more importantly, genetic analysis confirmed that the fetus carried modifications that should provide complete immunity to the pathogen. The embryo was female. Sarah Chen, named after Bryan's late wife, represented the culmination of everything they had learned. Her genetic code contained carefully crafted modifications that preserved essential human characteristics while adding protections against the extraterrestrial pathogen. If successful, she would be the first woman born on Earth in over 3 years. But the project faced constant opposition. Outside the facility, protesters from the purist movement held vigil, claiming that Sarah and others like her were abominations against nature. Their leader, Father Michael Torres, had once been a respected theologian. Now he preached that the plague was God's judgment, and any attempt to circumvent it through genetic manipulation was the deepest sin imaginable. "We are not meant to play God," Torres declared in his broadcasts. "These creatures they are creating are not human. They are chimeras, demons wearing human faces. True humanity, no honeyans with us," as it was intended. The threats had escalated beyond mere protests. 3 other research facilities had been bombed by extremist groups. The Peace Enforcement Corps had intercepted plans for a coordinated attack on all major genetic research centers, including Bryan's facility. Security had been increased to military levels, but the danger remained constant. International tensions also persisted within the alliance. The Chinese delegation demanded priority access to the artificial womb technology for their own programs. The Russians insisted on independent verification of all genetic modifications to prevent Western scientists from creating superior versions of humanity. African leaders threatened to withdraw from the alliance if they didn't receive guarantees of equal access to the new reproductive technology. General Harrison, now serving as the alliance's security director, managed these conflicts with increasing difficulty. Resources remained scarce, and every decision created winners and losers among the surviving communities. The delicate balance that held the alliance together was constantly threatening to collapse. Despite the challenges, the research continued. Brian's team had successfully created 12 viable embryos, 6 male and 6 female, all carrying genetic modifications for pathogen resistance. Early tests showed promising results. Tissue samples from the developing fetuses showed complete immunity when exposed to concentrated doses of the pathogen. Dr. James Crawford, now Brian's closest collaborator, had made additional breakthroughs in genetic diversity preservation. By combining stored genetic material from thousands of pre-plague donors, they had created embryos that maintained the full spectrum of human genetic variation while adding the necessary protections. The new humans would not be clones or simplified versions of their predecessors. They would be as genetically diverse as any generation in human history. The timeline for the first births had been established. 6 months for Sarah and her cohort. If successful, the Alliance planned to establish birthing centers in secure locations around the world, each capable of supporting dozens of artificial wombs. The goal was ambitious. Within 10 years, they hoped to achieve a sustainable birth rate that could stabilize human population. But significant challenges remained. The artificial wombs required constant maintenance and sophisticated life support systems. Only a few dozen facilities worldwide had the capability to support them, making the new humans extremely vulnerable to attack or system failure. The psychological implications were equally complex. These children would be raised by men who would never experience parenthood in the traditional sense, in communities haunted by the memory of lost mothers. Educational systems were being redesigned to address these unique challenges. Child development experts, all male survivors who had studied pre-plague research, were creating new approaches to raising healthy children in a world without maternal figures. Foster networks were established to ensure that every new child would have multiple caretakers and role models. Brian found himself at the center of all these preparations. As the lead scientist on the reproduction project, he was responsible not just for the technical success of the artificial wombs, but for the entire future of human civilization. The weight of that responsibility was overwhelming, but it was also the only thing that made his survival meaningful. Late at night, alone in his laboratory, he would sometimes talk to the developing embryos in their chambers. He told them about their mothers, about Sarah's kindness, Emma's laughter, about the billions of women whose memories were all that remained of half of human experience. "You'll never meet them," he whispered to Sarah's chamber during one such vigil, "but they're the reason you exist. Every modification in your DNA, every system keeping you alive, it's all because we refuse to let them be forgotten. You are their legacy, their continuation. You are the bridge between what we lost and what we might become." The first contractions in the artificial wombs were detected on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 4 years after the plague began. Sarah Chen, the first woman to be born on Earth since the extinction, arrived after a 12-hour labor that was monitored by scientists around the world. She was healthy, normal in every way except for the genetic modifications that made her survival possible. Brian held her in his arms as cameras recorded the moment for history. She looked exactly like any human baby, but she represented something unprecedented. Proof that humanity could adapt, evolve, and survive even the most catastrophic challenges. Within hours, 5 more babies were born from the artificial wombs. 3 girls and 2 boys, all healthy, all carrying immunity to the pathogen that had nearly ended their species. The Peace Enforcement Corps established a defensive perimeter around the facility as news of the successful births spread worldwide. The reactions were as divided as expected. Alliance leaders celebrated the achievement as humanity's greatest triumph. Religious groups split between those who saw the births as miraculous and those who condemned them as blasphemous. Purist extremists increased their threats, calling for the immediate destruction of all artificial womb facilities. But for Brian, Holding Sarah as she opened her eyes for the first time, none of the controversy mattered. Humanity had a future again. It would be different from anything that had come before, shaped by loss and trauma and unprecedented challenges. But it would continue. The last generation of natural-born humans would become the guardians of the first generation of the enhanced. Together, they would rebuild civilization from the ashes of the plague, carrying forward the memories of those they had lost, while creating something entirely new. In that moment, as Sarah grasped his finger with surprising strength, Brian felt something he had not experienced since the plague began. Hope, not just for survival, but for renewal. The dead could not be brought back, but they would not be forgotten. Their genetic legacy, their dreams, their love, all of it would live on in these children who represented humanity's refusal to accept extinction. The future remained uncertain. There would be more challenges, more conflicts, more threats to overcome. But there would also be laughter, discovery, growth, and love. Humanity would continue, changed but unbroken, ready to face whatever the universe might throw at them next. And in laboratories around the world, more chambers hummed with life, nurturing the next generation of a species that had learned to remake itself rather than surrender to fate.